So my question is, who's looking forward to going away on holiday? Correct. But there's an assumption, obviously, in that question that you're going away on holiday. I remember, and this speaks directly to our topic, that for quite a number of years, and as Tony just mentioned, that we have a child who has these very serious medical challenges. And right at the beginning, when we didn't really know what we were dealing with, she had a series of episodes, and they all happened in Decembers. So there were a few Decembers in a row that we landed up being very trapped at home, because we had to be, at that time, the protocol from the doctors was that we had to be within 10 to 15 minutes range of a good hospital. So we didn't go anywhere. And everybody said to me, oh, but Joburg is so nice at this time of the year, right? Which is great when you're going to Plet. Then you could tell us that Joburg is so nice at this time of the year. But when you're pretty much within range of a hospital and you land up in ICU, it's not so nice at this time of the year. So anyhow, the reason I asked the question about if you're looking forward to going away, and this wasn't to make you feel uncomfortable if you don't have plans to go away, was because what's the value of going away? To refresh, right? So let me ask you, which is the better method? To take one big holiday once a year, or to get away for a day or two multiple times during the year? Which is the better method? The second option, right? Right, if you found it from experience, trial and error. So the better version is to get away frequently, even if it's for shorter times. Why is that? Okay, so we need mental health breaks. Let's unpack that a little bit further. Why? Why do we need frequent mental health breaks? Let's forget about all the theory for a second, okay? Let's just talk from our own experience, from real life experience. What's going on? What's going on in our lives on a daily basis?
Constant life pressure.
Constant. That's the key word, right? The key word is constant. There is constant life pressure. None of the questions I'm asking are personal, okay? So you don't have to feel in any way that you're being exposed. But have you ever heard of something called a snooze button? Familiar with a snooze button? It's one of the worst inventions. No, I'll tell you why it's one of the worst inventions. Because firstly, it gives you the illusion that you're actually getting to sleep more. But it's not necessarily quality sleep. Although sometimes you'll say, especially if you are a mother of young children, you'll say, well, that sleep for those last 15, 20 minutes actually makes all the difference. But the other reason is it gives us the illusion that because we're sleeping a little bit extra, that life is a little bit calmer, which it isn't. Because it doesn't matter if you wake up the first time your alarm goes off or if you wake up the third time your alarm goes off. What happens when you wake up is pretty much the same. And that is we go from rest to turbo faster than a Porsche. Right? So and then that's constant. Once we're going, we're going. In fact, let's just do it again. Another experiment. Sitting here in this group as we are right now. Does anybody here not know what they're doing next after this talk? Does anybody here not know what's happening next? What's the next item on your agenda? Of course you know what's the next item. In fact, while we're sitting here, part of your brain is occupied with whatever's happening next. Right? So it's not only that it's constant, but it is cascading and overlapping. So I went out, it's just been the Yontif season, which in a rabbi's life is high pressure stakes. It's an incredibly busy time of the year. And in a Rebbitzon's life, even more so. And we try every year after the whole Yontif season, we try to do something, ideally get away for a couple of days, or at the very least, like we did this week, just went out for supper. You have no concept of how much of a relief it is to go out to a meal that, I'm not speaking for myself, I'm speaking for my wife, that she didn't have to cook, after all of that hosting and whatever the case is. So we're sitting there, and I'm sure you've had this experience, and you see I walk into the room, and the first thing I do is I find a place to put my hat, right? Now, kosher restaurants don't have places for rabbis' hats. I don't know if you've ever, I mean, it's a design flaw in the kosher restaurants. They don't have a place for rabbis' hats. You'd think they'd know these things. So, maybe. So I'm looking for a place to put my hat, and there was literally nowhere. So I put it on the corner of the table. So just picture the scene. So we're sitting over there, and it's not a very large table, and I've got my hat on the corner of the table. You know what was great about having my hat on the table? Come and try guess. Nobody took my table, or nobody took my hat. What's the best thing about having the hat? You'll never. I don't think you'll think of this. The best thing about having my hat on the table. That's right. But what? They didn't recognize you. You know, it's like the guy with the big beard and the payers and whatever, puts on a baseball cap and he thinks nobody knows that he's Jewish, right? You know what the best part about putting the hat on the table was? I then put my cell phone under my hat. That was the best part. And it was intriguing to look around and see how frequently in the course of people spending quality time together, how frequently they were using their phone. Just sending this message, just replying to that message, or whatever it is. I mean, obviously I don't know what they were doing, but the fact is they were using their phone. So that's an illustration of the fact that we've got this constant barrage of stuff that's always on our heads, and that's why it's better to have micro vacations than one big vacation, because we actually need time on a regular basis just to reset, just to center ourselves, to regulate, right? So what's the worst thing about going away? Packing.
I think packing up and getting back.
Yes, exactly. I agree with that. I think when you come back and you have to unpack what you packed, that's much worse. But what's in the most generic sense, what's the worst thing about going away? Coming back. Like I remember as a child, I don't know if you did road trips as a kid, but I remember as a kid we used to drive often to the KwaZulu-Natal coast, and the drive there, unbelievable. It's so exciting. You know, how much longer, and you're going, and the scenery changes, and it becomes a little bit more lush. Driving back, there is nothing worse than the N3 from Germiston to Joburg. That just kills your mojo, you know, as you're coming back from the coast. So it doesn't matter if you go to Thailand, if you go to Zanzibar, if you go to the Kruger, if you go to the Vol, it doesn't make a difference. By the next day, it's gone. Would you agree with that? So you invest all this time and planning and money and whatever, and you come back, and regardless of how good the holiday was, it dissipates so rapidly. And that's really the theme of what we're going to speak about over here today. And I'm glad that out of all the various dates that were possible for this particular talk, it landed up being this week, because it gives us a resource that we're going to call on that is from the Torah portion that Jewish communities around the world are going to read this coming Saturday. We're going to pull on that wisdom to try and find a way that you can actually not live with chronic stress or trauma or whatever the challenges are that we're having in our lives, even when you don't get to escape them. Because that's one of the key things that we learned with our daughter, is that when you have a chronic medical condition and you're the person responsible to manage it, there is no escape. So you go on holiday and you take her on holiday. And if you go on holiday without her, you take the stress of, has she had the right medications at the right time, whatever. And it taught me that the key to surviving and the key to being resilient and the key to healing is not to get away from the storms in our life. It's to find a way to float above the raging waters of those storms. So that's what we're going to speak about over here today. So the Torah portion that we read this week is considered the single most common story in all cultures, which is the story of Noah and the great flood. Now, the name Noah might change in certain cultures, but what they call, the more scientific term for it is the flood myth is the single most common legend across cultures, across the planet, which is quite fascinating. So how much do we know about the story? Let's unpack the story for a moment or two and try and use it as a way to learn some strategies, techniques, mindsets that we could use in our own lives. So let's start with the absolute basics. What's the story? It's not a test. Right? The animals came 2 by 2. That's probably one of the most well-known things, right? Okay. I mean, I have an issue. I have an issue with Noah. Why he let the mosquitoes in? Right? Okay. So the animals came. Why did the animals come? Because there was going to be a flood, right? Why was there going to be a flood?
Because God was unhappy with the people.
Because humans, for a change, wrecked things. That's kind of the story of the whole of history. The world is a beautiful place until the humans come along. That's why many of us like to go into the bush. Right? People who don't live in this part of the world don't understand the concept. One of the things that irritates me the most when they come and they say, we're going on safari. Okay, if you're going on safari, you're not going to the bush. Safari is like you coming with your big telescopic lens and you're going to, I don't know what you think you're going to do, but going to the bush is to escape humanity. It's the closest you can get to the Garden of Eden, you know, being out in nature. So the humans came along, the humans made a real mess. And so as a result, God says that's it, he's going to flood the whole world. Who's going to survive? The guy had obviously the most miles. He could get into first class. Everybody else is stuck outside, right? Okay, so who's the person who survives? This is critical to the story. What's his name? So it's not a secret, this. His name is Noah, right? Okay, his name is Noah. Now, what's the Hebrew of Noah? Noach. Noach. Okay, Noach. What does Noach translate as?
Serenity.
Calm, serenity. Who's your favorite superhero? Okay, that's not your favorite superhero. What's the first superhero who comes to mind? Who's the first superhero who comes to mind? Superman, right? I heard Batman. Who said Batman? It says a lot about people, by the way, if you choose the vigilante as your hero. Okay, so so Superman. Yeah, who else? Okay, we'll go with Superman for a second. Why are we going to go with Superman? Besides the fact that he is certainly the most iconic superhero that exists, but also because Superman's story is based on the story of the flood. Right? What were the creators of Superman? What was the name? It was Jerry Siegel and what's his name? Schuster or something like that. 2 Jewish guys who invented Superman. It's the story of the flood. It really is. Okay, how much do you know about the story of Superman? Where is Superman born? Krypton. Thank you. At least we got somebody. Okay, so he's born on Krypton, and then what's going to happen? Krypton is going to be destroyed. So he gets put into a little capsule, which is the more sci-fi version of an ark, and gets sent away in order to kind of start a life again somewhere else. I mean, it's literally the story. And in context, and this is less humorous, but in context, this was a post-Holocaust story. And it was supposed to be about a metaphoric version of the world being destroyed in the Holocaust, and then those who were going to be sent away to other lands, like some of us. I mean, my grandfather was literally put on a boat and sent to South Africa. They didn't even know where South Africa was. Never saw his family again, like that kind of concept, in order to be able to repopulate and reestablish the world. Now think of the kind of trauma that these people had, and think of the kind of pain that these people carried with them, and think of the resilience that they brought to the places they came. So usually when you think of a superhero, you think of somebody who's got bulging biceps and a flowing cape, and they've got probably a strong nature, because they're going to go out there and they're going to change the world. And even if it's not the comic book superhero, if you think about heroes in society, you expect that a hero is somebody who's got a lot of strength and probably a little bit of an A-type personality, because if they're going to make a difference to the world, they're going to have to stand up to the forces and the powers that be. You don't think of a superhero as Noach, as somebody who is tranquil. You don't think of a superhero as a peaceful character, or even a hero, a regular hero. You don't think as a peaceful character. You think of them as a driven, strong personality. So it's quite interesting that we've got a character who's going to save the world, and his name is Noach. That's relevant to our story. Now, inside that ark, and they spent a year on the ark, how tranquil do you think it was? Okay, let's see. What was the closest experience we might have had in our lives to that year on the ark? COVID lockdown. And let's be honest, we had COVID lockdown in one of the best places in the world to do so. Beautiful temperature, climate's great, everybody's got at least a little garden or something, you could get outside. No, your neighbors were not reporting you to the police as they were doing in other parts of the world. I think as lockdowns go, perhaps we weren't. Imagine you were doing COVID lockdown in some little apartment in the middle of, I don't know, let's say Paris or London or New York. At the end of that, the greatest miracle of COVID is not how many people landed up not dying from the disease, but how many people landed up not dying at the hands of their own family. Can you imagine living for a year with all of these animals and a good dose of seasickness, I would imagine? Imagine elephants getting seasick. I mean, it couldn't have been fun. It doesn't sound like a tranquil environment, right? Really does not sound like a tranquil environment. And yet, the individual who is the hero of this story is called Noach, which means to be at peace and to be at rest and to be in a state of serenity. That is illustrative for us. That's indicative. That's telling us something. It's something that we should be learning in our own lives. The world is swirling around him. It's absolute chaos. And by the way, I think one of the biggest things about it is he was not told how long this would last. I think one of the most difficult issues to deal with in life is not knowing when it will end, whatever it is that we're going through, not knowing that it will end. So, for example, if a person has to go to the dentist, it might be a terrible experience, might bring a whole lot of trauma, it might be a very painful experience, but the dentist can tell you this will only take 15 minutes or whatever the case is. Okay, so I'll somehow withstand 15, 20 minutes. But when we don't know when it's going to end, so they're just like bouncing around inside this arc for month after month after month. Eventually it reaches the point where we think, will it ever end? And that's where we have our greatest stress, is the stuff that feels like it's never going to end. It could be a personal challenge, it could be a health challenge, it could be a financial challenge, or it could just simply be the overwhelm of living in the 21st century, where it literally feels like it will never end. Does anybody in this room use any kind of an app for tasks? Like a to-do list app or a workflow thing that you use maybe as a group, Slack, Asana, Monday.com, anything like that, right? They never end. There's never a time where you can say, that's it, my to-do list is done. All that happens is, besides the fact that it keeps adding to it, you get to the end of the year and you pack up your office and say, I'll be back in January, and you know what's going to happen in January. There's still going to be that list still from last year that's just going to add to next year. So it's when we deal with stuff that feels like it's never going to end, whether it is pain, whether it is trauma, whether it's a family issue, whether it is a health issue, or whether it's just simply the overwhelm of day-to-day living, that's when we feel like we're going to drown. And isn't it interesting that we use language that is associated with water to describe when we're feeling very stressed? Right? Let's think, what are the idioms that we use related to water that have to do with stress? I'm drowning. It's a typical person. I'm drowning. What else do we say? I'm feeling flooded. Right? What else?
This is just a drop in the ocean.
Exactly. It's a drop in the ocean. Exactly. I feel like I'm just treading water, or trying to keep my head above water. How often do people say that? I'm just trying to keep my head above water. Even the word inundated actually means flooded. I'm sinking. Right? It's fascinating. Without even realizing, in our normal conversation, the language that we use around overwhelm, which incidentally, by the way, the word overwhelm means to be turned over, often by water. So like the ship that capsizes is overwhelmed, right? So often the terms that we use to relate to overwhelm are actually water-based metaphors. Why? Because the story of the flood, which is the most commonly used story across all cultures, is the story of how humans are supposed to deal with things that overwhelm us. So there's got to be a lot of wisdom in this particular story to find out how to survive, how to be a Noach, how to be a person who is centered and calm and in a state of serenity even when there is a raging storm. Not because I've managed to take a holiday from the storm, but even in the storm. That's the real greatness. That's the real wisdom. So I mentioned a little before about Holocaust survivors and the idea of the escaping Krypton and all of those themes. There's a particular picture that I only got to see after we had been married for a few years. I'm not sure how the picture surfaced, but it is, to me, one of the most powerful photographs I've ever seen in my life. It's the photo of my wife's paternal grandparents at their wedding. Now, let's just pause for a moment. We know what our weddings are like in the 21st century, right? First of all, nobody trusts the photographer, so they're all taking their own photos, right? So you come out of your average wedding today, there's a few hundred photos of the chuppah. They have one photo of the entire wedding, top to bottom, they have one photo. Then think about what goes into preparing a wedding in today's world. You've got to have the right flowers, and you've got to have the right music when you come down the aisle, and to open the dancing, and the menu's got to be exactly right, and the dress, and the this, and all these various things, right? I don't know what was on the menu of their wedding, but I want to tell you about the wedding dress, because that's why I say this is one of the most powerful photographs I've ever seen. So the grandfather is wearing a suit jacket as the groom and a tie. I think he's wearing a tie in the picture. The grandmother is also wearing a suit jacket, a men's suit jacket. And she's wearing a hat. And she was a seamstress, so she had stitched a veil to the brim of the hat. They got married in a displaced persons camp. He had lost his first wife and child in a concentration camp. I look at that photo and I think, how did they do that? How did they have the courage to get married? They had 2 of their 3 children still in the DP camp. Everybody thinks that after the Holocaust ended, everybody went home. They were in the DP camp long enough to have 2 children. How did they have the courage to be able to get married? And the fact that what they wore was simple, that doesn't surprise us so much. But the idea of having that kind of resilience to say, I'm going to step back into the world and I'm going to invest in another generation after I've just seen what humans are capable of. It humbles us who can fall to pieces if we arrive at our favorite coffee spot and they're out of almond milk. So where did they get that resilience? How did they have that capacity, that Noach, that even in a world that wasn't just flooded, a world that was completely destroyed, they were able to move forward? I'm not saying they didn't have lingering issues. I'm not saying that there was no generational trauma that was passed to their children and possibly their grandchildren. That all happened. And in spite of all of that, they still went ahead and they invested in the next generation. Where did that come from? So there's a great teaching, which I really think is the kind of thing that we can apply in our lives on a regular basis and will help us to at least move in this direction. I don't know if anybody walks out of a talk and says, that's it, my life has changed forever, because then I would have changed already, right? But at least we get a little bit of an inkling of some kind of wisdom that we can apply in our lives. See, our big issue is not the extent of the stuff that we're dealing with, but the amount of the stuff that we're dealing with. In other words, if you read, for example, Viktor Frankl, what he was dealing with, like all of the other people in the concentration camps, was more devastating than anything we could ever imagine. And at the same time, he was dealing with only one thing: survival. And it's an interesting thing about the human condition that when we have a single focus, even if that single focus requires every bit of resilience and energy and innovation that we have, because we know what we're dealing with, we can get out there and do it. But when we're being pulled in a million directions, very often that's when we can't actually deal with any of the stuff. And so on an objective scale, what we're dealing with might be far less of an issue than what others have dealt with. But on our subjective reality, it's completely flooding. It's completely overwhelming. So what we've got to try and find is somewhere in all of this chaos, our little escape pod, which for Noach was the ark, and for Kal-El, for those people who know the Superman story, that was the little capsule that he was put in, that he's going to survive. Or if it's the lifeboat on the sinking ship. We need that capsule. And it can't wait until December, and it can't wait until the long weekend. It's got to be something that we can find on a regular basis. In fact, ideally, it's something we should be able to find on a daily basis. Because if we have that one place every single day, or that one experience every single day that we can cocoon into, it gives us the wherewithal to get through the stuff that's going to happen during the course of the rest of the day. And that is really regardless of what that stuff is. Some days will be better, some days will be worse. Nobody should be that idealistic to suggest that follow this formula and every day is going to be great. That's not how life works. We just want it to be better than what it already is, or better than what is, so to speak, the median, the normal way that people behave. So we know that Noach goes into an ark. I don't know what the ark looks like to you. I would assume different people have different ideas of the actual design of the ark. But I'd like to think of it kind of as this capsule. Just think of it like as a capsule. We know there was more narrow at the top and it was wider at the bottom to make it buoyant and not flip over in the sea. This whole business of the big deck, that you see in most illustrations of the ark that had the big open deck, I don't think so. It wasn't an MSC cruise. So it was probably just an enclosed environment that they got everybody into. It was almost like a submergible submarine kind of thing, except that it floated. Now, what's interesting about the story, before we get to what the teva is supposed to represent, I think there's a really critical piece of information we have to know about the story. Does anybody remember where they eventually landed up after floating around for a whole year, not knowing when this thing was going to end, without any navigation system, no GPS? Where did they eventually land up? Anybody remember? On top of a mountain. When your boat lands on a mountain, you know that there's a problem. Right? So at the end of the story, they land up on a mountain, and if you go to Turkey, they'll tell you, we know which mountain it is. If you go to Ethiopia, they'll tell you, we know which mountain it is. Okay, so we don't know which mountain it is. It's called Ararat in the Torah, but we don't know if that's the same as Mount Ararat today in Turkey. The fact of the matter is they land on a mountain. What does that tell you? That tells you that there was obviously a massive swell of water. But it also tells you that the ark is carried by the same force that is destroying everything else. I had a guy yesterday come speak to me about something, and just before he left, he told me a story that really blew my mind. So this fellow and his wife were in the tsunami. Remember the tsunami? What year was it? I can't even remember what year it was. The tsunami in Thailand, 2006? Okay, whatever. Okay? So they were there. They were in the tsunami. They arrived in Phuket 2 days before the tsunami. And they flew with a friend of theirs who at the time was not married. So he was a guy probably in his 50s, single. And he took a ground floor hotel room in Phuket. Not a religious person, but the story is a religious story. So the other couple, the people I know, they're very organized. They're the kind of people that they get into the hotel room, within 10 minutes, everything's hanging and everything's exactly where it needs to be. He was living more the bachelor life. So 2 days in, his stuff was still all in his suitcase, lying next to his bed. But despite not being a religious guy, every single morning he got up and he put on his tefillin, and he put on his talis, and he did his morning prayers every single morning. So the morning of the tsunami, he got up, did his prayers with his talis, with his tefillin, and there was a little wooden table. So he put his talis and his tefillin and his siddur onto the wooden table, and went out to do whatever he was going to do. The tsunami hit. He was fortunate to get to higher ground. He wasn't harmed, but he had a ground floor room. About 2 days later, whenever it was that they could come back to the hotel, he goes to his room to see what he could salvage. So he says the mark of the water line was at the ceiling. So the room had completely filled with water. The table with his tefillin and his talis and his siddur was completely bone dry. Nothing was damaged. Not a page of the book was damaged. So what had happened, as the water flooded the room, it lifted the table literally all the way till the ceiling. And I guess there must have been a small gap of where the water didn't actually, reach the top. So the table protected his stuff from being damaged. Everything else was destroyed. But that table, everything was saved. That's what an ark is. An ark is a mechanism that allows you to not only survive the forces that are out there to destroy everything, but that the same force that would destroy others or even us in different circumstances, that same force is the force that raises us up. That's the first attitude and perspective that is useful to learn. I don't have to drown just because there's a flood. There are ways to float when there's a flood. Exactly. You just can't say whatever floats your boat, because you've got to know what floats your boat. Right? And just to go back for one moment to our story, our daughter was diagnosed at the end of 2019. And it's the one time in my life that I honestly felt like I was completely drowning. It was such an unexpected outcome, and it was such a shock to the system, and we had no information because her disease is so rare, and forget about it in South Africa, in the world, they still now don't know about it. I might, if I remember, tell you an incredible story that happened a couple of months ago, which relates to this. But at the time, I felt completely flooded, and my wife was the same. We hadn't told our children yet because we didn't even know what to tell them. And just for context, some of our children were already adult children at that point, and we didn't even know what to tell them. And so that was November 2019. We landed up taking her to Israel, to Sheba Hospital in February 2020. We thought were going to give us all the answers that we needed, and actually said we know nothing. So it was a very disappointing trip. And we came back and went straight into lockdown for the year. So the same lockdown that was devastating so much of society in terms of the social disconnect and the depression that many people experienced and the financial pressure, saved us, because it allowed us an opportunity to step back from community responsibility and to get ourselves onto the same page as a family and work out what we were going to do with this information. And it was in the course of the lockdown and the conversations that we had with our kids that we reached the point where we said, either this experience is going to completely devastate us or it's going to completely lift us. We have to make that choice. So that's what happens, right? There's this flood. Either the flood is going to destroy us, or we're going to find a mechanism where we use it actually to raise ourselves, almost like a surfer who's looking for the wave that the rest of us are running from. So how do we find this? How do we generate this ark, this place, this safety net, or this escape pod? How do we get there? So there's a great Jewish sage, the founder of the Hasidic movement, called the Baal Shem Tov, who observes that the Hebrew word for ark is the word teva, which is the same Hebrew word for word. So he translates the verse where God says to Noah, "Boy el hateva, come into the ark." He translates that as an invitation where God is saying, "Come into the word." In other words, you can surround yourself with the words that will carry you, protect you, and actually allow you to float when everybody else is drowning. And when I say everybody else, I don't mean other people. We're not here to judge other people. I mean the other versions of myself that would have drowned. So there's the version of myself that could drown, there's the version of myself that could float. When I come into those words, what that allows me is the opportunity to float. Now, the question is, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to come into the words? So I haven't been snooping around in anybody's morning routine, but I have a sense of what morning routines are generally like. Most morning routines are chaos. It's just a question of how much chaos. Because we're under a lot of pressure. And if there are other little people living in our house, then there's additional pressure. You know, you've got to get these people ready, and that one has to have breakfast, and this one refuses to get dressed, and that one doesn't want to eat. And I'm under pressure, and I've got my whole thing that I want to do. Even if I've got those rituals that I do every single morning that are supposed to help me center myself and calm myself, you know, maybe I do some exercise, or maybe I have my coffee in a particular way, whatever the case is, they actually add to our stress. That's the fascinating thing about living in the 21st century. The de-stressing rituals stress us out. Fascinating, right? So imagine if we took a few moments every morning to immerse ourselves in words of meditation, words of prayer, words of wisdom, Torah wisdom. But the key is to immerse ourselves. And we're not good at immersion in today's world. We're good at being flooded. We're not good at immersion. Unless, of course, you're one of these people who does the ice bath plunge thing. Then, you know, maybe you're maybe you're good at immersion. But we're not good at immersion. I'll explain to you what I mean. What we're not good at immersion. To immerse yourself in something means nothing else exists during those few minutes. And our biggest challenge in modern living is that everything else seems to exist all the time. So imagine if we were able to create a space, and I don't mean a physical space, I mean a mental space, every single morning, before we get caught up in the tsunami of life, where we just center ourselves with something that we've prepared in advance, which is a meditative prayer that we say, and words of wisdom that we study. And during that time, nothing and no one else exists. I'll tell you a funny story. There was a very intriguing character in the, I think he must have lived in the 18th century. His name was Rabbi Herschel Ostropola. In those days, your surname came either from the place you lived, or the work you did, or a physical feature that you had. So Ostropola means he came from the town of Ostropol. When this Rabbi Herschel was still a yeshiva student, so he was studying in a yeshiva in one of the towns, and the way it used to work in that environment, it's not like today. You know, today guys go off to Israel and you pay a lot of money and you get put up in a dormitory and they give you great food, right? Yeah. and then you study and you don't have a worry in the world because everything is taken care of. In those days, when you went to study in the yeshiva system, the community used to feed the boys. And they had a system which was called the Essen Teg system, which meant every day you were allocated a family and you went to a different family each day for a meal. Now, if you were a member of that community, you had no choice. You had to host the boys. I mean, it was embarrassing not to host the boys. So what happens if you're a stingy person and you don't really want to spend money on other people? What do? So there was one such family in this town. They had no choice. They had to host, but they didn't actually want to spend the money on the boys. So they had a system where the husband and wife would tag team. So the boy would sit down to eat, and the husband would start interviewing him with all the questions. Where are you from? Do you know this one? Do you know that one? Meantime, the wife would eat her meal. Then when she finished, she'd start interviewing him. He'd eat his meal, and then they'd say, oh, the meal's over, and clear away the plate of the boy who hadn't gotten to eat anything because he'd been interviewed. So you can imagine that the young boys were really, really upset about this, and they were talking amongst themselves, and this Reb Herschel says, don't worry, when I go to these people, I'm going to sort them out. So it turns out that he gets invited for Friday nights. Friday night's a more elaborate meal, right? So they sit down over there at the meal, and they bring out the first course, bring out some fish, and they say to him, where are you from? He says, I'm from Ostropol. Oh, you're from Ostropol, amazing. Do you know my friend Yankel? He's the butcher in Ostropol. Yeah, of course I know your friend Yankel. How's he doing? So they used to speak Yiddish. It sounds a lot richer in Yiddish. He says, gestorben. He's dead. The guy's totally shocked. He doesn't know what to say. Anyhow, Herschel quickly eats some fish, has a bit of salad. Okay, the husband's reeling from shock over here. They bring out the next course, bring out some chicken soup and whatever the case is. So tell me something. Do you know my other friend? His name is Chaim. He's the tailor in Ostropol. Yeah, of course. Who doesn't know Chaim? Everybody knows Chaim. How's he doing? Gestorben. Dead. And the guy gets so upset about this. Meantime, Herschel eats the soup. He sees the guy's not eating his soup, so he has some of that as well. They bring out the next course. Bring out some meat. Now he's worried. He's nervous. Should he ask? Shouldn't he ask? Eventually, he says to him, "Tell me something. Do you know Baruch? Baruch, the shoemaker. You know Baruch? Of course. How's he doing? Gestorben." And now the guy can't eat. He's lost his appetite. All his friends have died. All his friends from Ostropol have died. In the meantime, Herschel's having a feast. At the end of the meal, the guy turns to Herschel and he says, "What happened in Ostropol? Was there an epidemic? Was there a pogrom? What happened? Everybody died." So he says to him this, "As ich est, is die ganz Welt gestorben. When I eat, the whole world is dead." What's the message? When I immerse myself in something, nothing else exists. Nobody else exists. If we had a ritual every morning, 5 minutes, but during those 5 minutes, nothing exists. There is no phone. There is no next item on my agenda. There are no people. There's just me centered in the teva, in these meaningful words of meditative prayer, in these meaningful words of drawing on the richness and the wisdom of the great insights that kept people throughout history. The kind of insights and wisdom that allows somebody to walk out of the Holocaust and in a DP camp, start a new family before they even know where in the world they're going to be living. If I can draw on that insight, but in a very focused, immersive way on a daily basis, then whatever's going to happen during the day, which normally would threaten to flood me, is actually going to be the wind under my wings. It's going to now be what helps me to rise, to be more resilient, to have greater insight, to focus beyond myself and share with others and give to others, because ultimately that is what allows me the opportunity not to be completely sucked into the stuff that's dragging me down. That's how we become a Noach, a resting, serene, tranquil character in a world that never stops storming and flooding. So I really think what we need to do is we've got to move away from the hope and expectation that something dramatic is going to happen externally that's going to save me, and instead create a healthy ritual of how I invest in the stuff that centers me and empowers me, because then we will be those people floating on the crest of the waves that everybody else assumes are completely devastating. And it's something that each of us can do. I don't know if 5 minutes a day will be sufficient, but I suspect that 5 minutes a day is going to do a lot more than no minutes a day. And I really believe that when we start things in small increments, they make real difference, because typically we try and take big resolutions and bite off more than we can chew, and then we let ourselves down, and then we're more frustrated, and then we feel more flooded because we tried something else that didn't work, that just adds to our stress. So if we choose to do something which is doable, and it becomes a ritual, so it's repeated, it builds strength, and it builds resilience, and it builds insight. And please, God gives us the opportunity to float and to fly, rather than to be flooded and feel like we're always drowning.